88.9 FM in Irvine, over. Roger, you're listening to KUCI 88.9 FM in Irvine, over.
You're listening to 88.9 FM, KUCI Irvine. The opinions expressed on this program do not reflect the views of KUCI or the University of California, Irvine.
Good morning, Irvine. This is Chew Dog, the American Dream, and this is Living the Dream. Today, I have the interview that I was fortunate enough to have with Dr. Peter Kropp, who specializes in simulations and predictive modeling. And this was honestly a very fascinating interview, and it kind of went over time, so this is going to be a three-parter. Stay tuned, because this was such a fascinating field. So, you're affiliated with the English department, the film and digital media department, the informatics department. So, you can clearly do anything you want. So, what drew you to simulations? Like, why this subject matter as opposed to the multitude of other things you could have done?
Well, it's a little bit generational thing, right? So, when I was a student, when I was in undergraduate, film and media studies, for instance, didn't exist, or it was hiding inside of English departments or other discussion for arts, for interaction. So, I was on the internet as early as I could. So there are other formats that will sound way too ancient for your listeners that were very exciting to me when I was the age of our undergraduates now. And that led me in this direction of exploring, both from a history of technology point of view and from an interpretive point of view, various media technologies. From the history of the book to the history of the computer to the history of the internet. And I taught at a number of places after getting my PhD that were very good institutions. I had fun, but they were not nearly as interdisciplinary as Irvine is. So I came to Irvine in 2004 because they were looking for somebody who would do what they called new media. There's no such thing, but I'll take the job. And I'm happy I did, because at Irvine, the boundaries between different parts of campus are more permeable, right? Right away, from 2004, 2005 on, I was able to work with people in the School of the Arts, in information and computer sciences, in other schools, and that's only proliferated since then. So we helped start what is now the computer game science major. It was a long and difficult thing, because at first the administration didn't think that would be very respectable or academically rigorous, but we proved that it could be. And I've been involved with CalIT too, which maybe most students don't know much about, because it's mostly research and not teaching oriented, but it's a research institute on our campus that brings together people from dance, music, education, computer science, engineering, biomedical sciences, humanities, you name it. Anybody and everybody who wants to collaborate and look at our culture, our contemporary society under the influence of networked computing and networked media, online interactions, digital interactions, and so on. So that's the trajectory. That's why I kind of spread pretty broadly across different corners of campus, because Irvine makes that more possible and more easily accessible. And I hope to students as well.
And then, so kind of touching on one of the talks that you did, it was on YouTube. It's called Simulation and Discontent, for any of the listeners that are interested. And it's part of the UC Irvine channel, so they can subscribe to that. You briefly discussed how early games like chess were modeled after war games, and no one ever really discussed whether these were age appropriate like we do now. And I mean, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, why do you think that perspective shift happened? Like, Why do you think that happened? And then do you agree with that shift in perspective? Because, I have my own child, and I kind of just let him go at it. Like, he played that play game you talked about, and he thought it was really cool. And, now so he's become very insistent about wearing a mask and about taking protective measures. And, he threw a fit in the grocery store, and he's like, we need to leave. No one's social distancing. And he announced it. So I'm wondering, why do you think parents, where did the perspective shift happen? And what, is that necessarily a good thing from your viewpoint?
That's a big question. People who study the history of literature remember that in part of the 19th century, serialized novels were seen as bad for you because you were becoming too involved in your own head and your own emotions. And it was seen as bad for a certain type of young person, a child, teenager, juvenile, while they were still in an formal educational system. Now, of course, we see it the other way around, and we tell people that reading a graphic novel or a nonfiction book or a short story opens your eyes to other cultures, to other periods of time, makes you more capable of empathy and of relating to other types of people, to other generations, and so on. So similarly, I think with more technical media, it goes through a trajectory of, this is exciting because it's new, to, this is available everywhere and all children want to do only that instead of what we want them to do. And so when in that talk that you mentioned, when I referred back to H.G. Wells, who was a science fiction writer about 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, he wrote about games and war games, and especially tabletop and floor simulations of military conflict. He literally calls it something that would develop the intellect of a young person. And, it becomes highly technical and kind of black boxed inside of the computer after the introduction of computers and the invention of computer games. And for a while, it's still seen as a training tool. And by the way, if you go to an Army base now, Navy, Marine, Air Force, you'll see that a lot of people in military training are still taking some of these titles as a serious training tool. Partly because it's training you to have the right kind of computer skills, interface skills, and partly because it engages your mind in different tactical and strategic dimensions. Critics nowadays say, this is bad, it normalizes or trivializes violence, it normalizes or trivializes certain kinds of views of humanity as politics. And I think we're going to see the swing back. It's a sort of a pendulum of attitudes. We get some moral panic about games, and then we get advocates who say, no, this is training a certain kind of intelligence, this is training a certain kind of thinking about it. My personal attitude, and I agree with you and what you said about your children, or attitude to young children now, is if the parents and the family members are around and talk to children about the experience that they just had on a screen, in a game, television, film, or just reading a book, then they can process almost anything. I mean, there are some things that are age inappropriate.
Right.
And I'm a parent of a kid who's now at college. I wasn't always happy to rush him into whatever, but as long as I'm around to process it afterwards, I think we shouldn't shield people from it, because the more taboo you make it, the more interesting it becomes, and then people binge, right? And so it's like when you make alcohol a little too taboo, then people binge drink when they're off to college instead of understanding what it is and when it's appropriate and how much is inappropriate. And the same thing I think about games. So the history of simulations is the history of computer-human interactions, And is the history of, every game is a simulation. Not every simulation is a game. There's some highly technical simulations that are interesting to me too. I just wrote a long study of the simulation of university administration. Nobody thinks that's a fun game, but to me, it's an interesting topic. Can you put what we do in the university inside a box and have algorithms act out the different interactions between staff, students, parents, administrators, faculty, politicians? They're just thought experiments, right? And we have a very long history of thought experiments. And if you want to defend games, you can say, thought experiments teach people how to think speculatively and how to anticipate consequences, even maybe think about some unthinkable scenarios. It's a discipline that we use in training, that we use in teaching, that we can use in higher education. So it's basically one thing that we should do at university.
Okay, so I'm gonna be jumping around because you touched on so many things that I wanted to ask you. The questions just popped in my head, but also that talk you gave on YouTube was fast. Girlfriend's kind of mad at me because I made her watch it with me last night because I thought it was really interesting. So one of the things you mentioned was try to put the university in a box. Has anybody thought about trying to put the university in the box and try to create a simulation as to what would happen, with bringing all the students back and the pandemic, and what the outcomes are going to likely be before they try to bring all these students back? Because from what we're seeing from all the other universities, the outcomes are not so good. So, has anyone tried this? Do you know of this? Was the university interested in at least using your work to try to model themselves?
Yeah. Anybody who's a serious administrator or manager knows that there are certain dashboards. So in the sciences, so epidemiology, for instance, in the current epidemic, we use dashboards. Experts use dashboards for certain kind of leading indicators. This is going to get worse. This is going to get better. This is how we can control it. This is how we might try to get a picture of things, to talk to politicians, to talk to the public, to talk to other experts. So there's some very serious simulations. At Berkeley, for instance, Mask Sim is a simulation that tries to model, if we have X percent of the population wear a mask strictly as in some Asian countries where they're more accepted, what difference does that make? Or if we don't, if we see the kind of low uptake that we see in parts of the United States, what difference does that make, right? So you want to model this in your head because this is the biggest field of application for simulation techniques. Mm-hmm. Stuff in real life can be dangerous, right? So think about the history of simulations back to early mechanical simulators. They were used to train people to control complicated machines, say a plane. Mm-hmm. Now, a flight simulator is still, you can go to places here in Orange County that are offering you an hour on a flight simulator, and it's seen as fun, but it's a serious training tool. Pilots need, even after 20 years of experience, to log a certain number of hours in a flight simulator to know different systems, different planes, keep their skills up. Why would people have thought of that in the first place, as primitive as the first flight simulators were? People are irreplaceable, and planes are expensive. Right? So you don't want to risk people too much who don't know anything yet, and you don't want to risk planes too much. So you're gonna model this in a lower risk environment where you can show people, if you do this, you'll crash. If you do that, the plane will take harm. If you do that, you lose your life or whatever it might be, right? So it's not just to instill fear or respect for the machine, but to train the correct kind of interactions.
Right.
And other simulators do the same thing, right? We try to model more complicated social and economic things. A lot of simulator games do that. A farming simulator or city or civilization type games, whatever. They basically try to put into algorithmic interactions. What are the agents? What are the dynamics? And how can I try to achieve the desirable outcome or equilibrium between different forces?
Yeah.
So when we have the university as a very complex socioeconomic mix between politics, education, fundamental research, applied research, interactions with other institutions that are competing with us, that are collaborating with us, future students, past students, sports, etc., multiple things. Like the university is not one thing. It's not like one input and one output. There are many inputs and many outputs. So how do you possibly reduce that? Well, it turns out people realize that you can train yourself to interact with computers in such a way as to outsource certain things that give us a headache, but that computers are good at. Computers don't get tired or bored. They don't make more mistakes after 24 hours of running the same calculation. A human would, right? So we can kind of let the computer do certain kinds of bookkeeping. Say, to translate your tabletop game, your floor game into the computer, you see maybe a little less. Now you just have your window, your portable or computer screen, and the computer has basically done a lot of the bookkeeping for you, right? You can save the game and close it. Next weekend, when you have time again to play, it's still there. You don't have to close the door to the room where you have that set up, etc. So it's very convenient for us that computers are very good at chaining together what if.
Right.
So in class, sometimes I make the joke about, we have these large lecture halls where you're not supposed to have food. And there's always somebody who brings food. I can rely on that.
Yeah.
So I make a bet with that person or the person sitting next to them and say, so the syllabus suggests no food in this room. That's part of the ground rules. Your sandwich cost, let's say, $5. The class is, let's say, 80 minutes. If you make a bet at the beginning of the class, say, if I get to eat the whole sandwich without being called on by the professor or called out, you pay. But if I get called out, then I'm on the hook for the cost. So it's a simple bet that you can make with a friend. That's a pretty straightforward bet, $5 or no dollars. But what if I call on that student and call them out for the breach of the rules 30 minutes through the 80, or 70 minutes through the 80? What's the bet worth then? Well, what if you've eaten more than half of the sandwich already? What is the current value of that bet? Right? Humans are going to not be able to do that on the back of an envelope very easily, but computers can easily say, okay, time value, sandwich value, or what's left of the sandwich, right? And say, okay, currently that bet is worth X. Right? If you were to reset it inside, most people don't reset their bets halfway through, but just as an illustration, a computer has no problem doing those on-the-fly calculations in the same way in which a computer has no problem giving you on-the-fly non-player characters that give you quests inside of a game or whatever. Those kind of things that are a little hard for a game master in a role-play game setting for you to do, but a computer can be programmed to have a table of events to call on and assign values to them. So both on the serious scientific application end, we use simulations to extrapolate and test really dangerous and difficult things, up to the non-destructive testing of our nuclear stockpile. Right? The United States is one of the nuclear powers we have control, and the University of California plays a big role in nuclear research. We have this stockpile. We want to make sure that, one, they don't accidentally go off. Two, they don't go bad and no longer can go off. Three, that we can, have a tally of where they are and how fit they are, how ready they are. And we can also tell that to other people, to investigators who, at the international agent level, or possibly to other countries who are comparing notes. Right? Where if you're negotiating a reduction of it, you want to be believable, without giving away all your secrets.
Right.
So, in other words, simulation is a pretty powerful way to look at computer and networked culture, which is permeating not just film and media and games, but permeating all kinds of other disciplines on campus that intersect.
Right. And then, moving on from that, I mean, you do talk a lot about simulations. I actually wanted to let you know, so you talk a lot about the flight simulators, and I thought that was really interesting because, I went and got a pilot's license, and I remember the flight instructor and was getting really frustrated because I was a much younger man then. I was like, I don't understand why we have to do simulator. And he said, the last place you want to learn something new is 5,000 feet in the air. So that was, pretty telling. But, you also mentioned when von Neumann's definition of the computer took off, we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, and we stopped using, policy advisors and military advisors at the table. And they didn't realize till about several decades later that there were some drawbacks to doing that. Could you expand on what those drawbacks were? Because, in the talk, you didn't get a chance to expand on that. And, how did they figure out what the drawbacks were? They were relying pretty heavily on simulations pretty much immediately after that. So how did they figure out what these drawbacks were? And then what did they do to correct?
Well, if you look at the roots of this in 17th, 18th, 19th century policy advising and military training, you could get a feedback loop of people with actual experience in politics or in the military to come back and say, okay, this exercise, not as realistic as it should be. One famous example is the incursion of Napoleon into Russia. They didn't understand how much weather would be a factor. Right? So now, if we play advanced games or use simulations to think through such a campaign, we know from having looped that back in that weather is a factor. Weather impacts logistics, weather impacts communication, weather impacts the health of people exposed to it, etc. So if you have any such simulation of a military campaign without not just looking at forces and terrain and tactics and strategy, but you need to factor in weather, we know that now, right? We've learned that lesson the hard way by seeing troops get stuck in harsh winters or in desert climates or whatever. What does sand do to tanks? Right? So you get the experienced people to come back and say, actually, we didn't consider enough factors. Now, that complicates the simulation, but it makes it more realistic, more valuable. If you have more inputs, you can get more accurate output. Now, the problem is if you have so much input that it takes a very, very long time to arrive at a decision, then it's impractical. Let's just not talk about only military applications, but large corporations, multinationals, let's say an oil company, a car company, they're dealing with different regulatory environments, they're dealing with different political settings, they're dealing with different attitudes to data and data governance, etc. If there's a change, they want to have that in their model so they can react, so they don't get caught in a bad situation in a particular country or continent or whatever. And those corporations, oil companies especially, have been using these very, very complex simulations to think through. Government agencies as well, not just military-oriented agencies, but policy-oriented. Or let's say somebody who's trying to plan something as complicated and large as the University of California physical plant, right? Buildings, maintenance, seismic retrofitting. There's multiple inputs that you couldn't consider Some of them are perhaps rare but particularly dangerous. Some of them are everyday and not dangerous. And you have to assign them the accurate value so you can plan ahead. This academic year, this 3 or 5 year period, this decade, this generation, etc. When do we need to replace? When do we need to go to the state or to somebody else to say, I'm sorry, but this building is no longer safe or no longer up to snuff for certain kinds of reasons, right? So whether it's this kind of situation or any other kind of situation, the more inputs you have, the more experience you can bring in through the feedback loop, the better. That makes them really complicated and cumbersome. So the decision process becomes so long that it's no longer practical for an officer in a combat situation or a politician in a short window of decision making to say, okay, I know what to do because I've run the numbers. It could take them, if it takes them more than 30 days to come to a decision, maybe that's too late, right? Or if to go back to the pandemic, if it takes our officials too long to settle on how to communicate the right kind of guidelines to the right number of people, then we suffer severe consequences. And over 200,000 Americans died, which is perhaps a much higher number than was necessary if it had been done earlier and communicated differently. Right. And so on the flip side of that is, the more complicated you make your inputs, the more cumbersome all these calculations. So people were very, very tempted very early on to black box these, to just program a computer and say, okay, we got an algorithm here, we got a data set here, we got a table of values here, and it's going to automatically spit out the recommendation that's appropriate. People tried that. For instance, there was a consultant from England, Stafford Beer, who was hired by the government of Chile to, Chile at that time was particularly reliant on caoutchouc and rubber, and all its byproducts, including making tires and other rubber products. And it's important, crucial to their economy. There are all sorts of international factors that you want to consider. You don't want to flood the market with too much. You don't, because then you jump the price and you hurt yourself, etc. And Stafford Beer came up with a way of sort of outsourcing the government of Chile to these terminals that look like a Wall Streeter's dream, and sort of just like automatically have the inputs and outputs correlate so that they never go below or above a certain kind of threshold. And system would automatically make the right kind of adjustments to keep prices and demand and supply, etc., in the equilibrium that they're looking for. Now, the government was overthrown, and we don't know how that would have worked out. There's a very fascinating study that a colleague of ours at MIT wrote a whole book about. Eden Medina wrote this really beautiful book about that cybernetic experiment of trying to automate an entire national economic decision-making process. We now know, several decades later, that if you put your trust into an automatic system too much, then you can be surprised, right? We see that with automatic trading systems on Wall Street. We see that with all kinds of other systems that can misunderstand the situation. The more you take humans out of a loop, the more you incur other kinds of risks. Humans are maybe a little slower to calculate certain kinds of risks. Humans maybe have some irrational awareness of risk or risk tolerance, but it's still essential to have humans in the loop in those kinds of socioeconomic situations. Our games also model the pandemic. I think I sent you a link to a video that I did with Dean of Humanities recently. I started talking about games that have been around for years. They're not new to this year, but became very popular this year because they were sort of epidemic simulators, where initially you were invited to play infecting as many people as possible. Yeah. And then, of course, under the impression of the current situation, you can also try to save as many people as possible. Again, we don't fully understand, as great as the science efforts that go into that are, we don't fully understand everything that goes into these complicated respiratory contagious diseases. We have a lot of entertainment that's about them, like zombie films and epidemic films and games and so on. And they all try to take off from a certain kind of model. How does this proliferate? How does it affect the people who are infected? And then how can you stop it, cure it, etc. But research is ongoing. And it would be an insult to our colleagues in the medical school to say that we understand this in the simulation. Our game is perfect. They're still making new discoveries and new suggestions as to what could be done, what kind of inoculation, what kind of vaccine, what kind of protective measures are better than others. And any small thing can ripple and proliferate and make a big difference. Just as we saw in the safety of certain kind of airplanes, people have been putting airplanes in the sky for more than 100 years, but there's still some risk. The risks have gone down, and we're happy about that, but more people go up in the sky, so it changes things. There are more planes, more other flying objects up in the air. That changes the calculus, and you have to kind of keep up, not just with the black boxing of certain things that can be outsourced with good conscience, but also be mindful of when you need humans in the loop to make the critical decisions.
Right. And that talk with, Dean Miller that you had, where you talked about the game Plague, there was, mention of how, having the interactive storytelling would actually help inform the public. And there was interest in demonstrating it to the public. And I mentioned I let my child play that game. And actually, the game has a they reintroduced it to the App Store with a fake news function. And I thought it was really interesting that you said that, because as soon as they introduced the fake news function, he's only 8 years old, but he started being more, what you said rang true, because he started being more discerning about some of the ads he would see on YouTube or some of the ads he would see on television. And he goes, I don't think that's true. And so it's kind of interesting that, because I didn't have that level of complexity till I hit my university years. And so do you think that the advent of these simulations is maybe introducing children to more complex thoughts earlier on? And is that necessarily a good thing?
Yes, it is introducing children to more complicated situations earlier than we had a generation or two ago. Certainly my parents did not have any exposure to anything similar. Fiction doesn't do the same thing, cinema doesn't do the same thing, television doesn't do the same thing as social media now does. The way that we've set it up for ourselves, on social media you can more quickly reach more people than people were able to with radio or newspapers or even the most dominant television events. And it's partly because it comes bite-size. It's the little quick bites, that Quibi wants to sell, or that Twitch or Instagram or other formats are very good at. And we're not yet trained to recognize that as the equivalent of propaganda by a certain kind of TV channel or newspaper or politician. But it's being exploited exactly for that very efficiently. It's an interesting, I think it's not exactly right to say that fake news spreads the same way as biological substance.
Right.
But it's a good analogy, right? It's a good comparison to say, they can be infectious in a way. But I enjoyed that game for that reason, because I've also been very interested in fake news and in information operations, where you can see countries trying to mess with other countries by sneaking in kind of believable but kind of disruptive stories, or stirring up some sentiment, some resentment, some problem. Sometimes very subtle, sometimes not so subtle. Famous examples of that have led to all-out military conflict. The leaking of a certain kind of telegram brought the United States into the First World War. The Zimmerman telegram that revealed that there was a deal being offered that would offer Mexico parts of the United States if they attacked as a distraction from the South, and therefore prevented the United States from getting involved in Europe or in Asia. And similar things happened, in the decades since then. So they can be quite consequential, these kinds of apparently small bite kinds of misdirection, misinformation, or disinformation ops. And they're very prevalent now. So those of us who are interested in media culture, in digital culture, and internet culture are looking at that and trying to figure out, okay, so it's easy to say education has an important role. Right? It's easy to say, how do we teach ourselves and our children, the next generation, media literacy that allows us to say, okay, where's my filter? Where's my corrective? Do I believe everything? Do I only believe certain things? Do I find some things beyond the pale? If I do, why is that? And how would I explain that to my roommates or to my neighbor, etc.? I've even seen some highly educated people when I was still on Facebook, which I now avoid for that reason. I saw some people fall for some harebrained stuff and actually pass it on. And people I'd known for a long, long time, and I actually had to have a heart-to-heart with them and said, why are you doing this? Why can't you recognize that this is taking you in a different direction from the smartest or most informed one? So it's a really fascinating analogy. At the same time, that is why this is such an exciting platform, right? And the interesting thing is every time that somebody says, "Oh, TikTok is dangerous," something else will pop up. It's not like any one of these places is the good or the bad corner. They're all susceptible to being infiltrated by something that's manipulative or possibly dangerous politically or otherwise. So yes, I think children are wrapping their head around this much earlier than previous generations. We are beginning to see how we can study that. We're beginning to see nation states and agencies and international agencies come up with suggestions on how to combat that in the same way in which we are beginning to see systematic collaboration with biological based pandemic that we want to combat together. Because we're beginning to see that this is not something where you can have a local solution. Irvine will do this, even if Orange County doesn't, or California doesn't, or US doesn't. No, we have more mobility of people, of ideas, of videos, of sound, etc. That doesn't respect borders or tax regimes or ideological separations or generational or whatever. And that's to go back to the very first thing we talked about. That's why, even though when I was an undergraduate student, this area of study didn't really exist by itself. It was sort of part of other things. It was part of sociology, it was part of computer science, it was part of English, it was part of history. But now it's become its own discipline with its own department. Nonetheless, I'm interested in playing with other departments, with informatics, etc. Because there's overlap of interest in seeing, how do we arrange our media technologies in such a way that we allow ourselves to be led in this direction. And what do we say to the people who are in charge of running Twitter or Facebook, or regulating Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, Twitch, YouTube, etc. And again, we know now from history that there could be a moral panic. There could be somebody, a senator, who famously says that all video games are bad, or that all novels are bad, or that television is brain rot, etc. And we begin to realize that not all of that is. It's not the technology itself, it's the use of it. And the different uses of these media technologies, of course, are sometimes highly entertaining and highly educational, highly valuable, but can also be abused. So I kind of tend to err on the side of wait and see. And before I condemn, for instance, a game like Plague and say this shouldn't be as popular as it is, it's hideous, it induces the idea that you can be the evil genius who tries to kill as many people on the planet as possible. It's a thought experiment. You're not actually doing it, right? Rain in a game doesn't get you wet. And it's cartoon violence often, it's like a Tom and Jerry thing that my parents saw on TV. It didn't make them violent. And so now if I watch The Sopranos, it doesn't make me a bad person. So why can't I play a game that is basically set in that kind of violent world? So we need to take things with a grain of salt and see, and realize that it's not something that I stand outside of. These are socioeconomic, cultural, complex situations that we are part of. Just like it doesn't make any sense to sit on the 405 and curse traffic because you're part of traffic. If you're there, you're part of it. You're not. You can't blame everybody else and not blame yourself. You're part of it. So how can we together make it differently, arrange it differently? That would be a more productive question.
Mm-hmm. And then kind of shifting gears a little bit because, I ate COVID-19 and disinformation is always, the hot, those are the hot topics. But, in that talk, you did mention that there were 3 national labs in California that that were part of predicting like thermonuclear outcomes. And, they are, I think you briefly mentioned that they were like part of predicting climate change outcomes because they're capable of doing the complex computing. And so I was curious, to your knowledge, were those computers used at all in attempting to predict outcomes for the California wildfires that were just like completely devastating for the state? Or were those computers used for something else? Could they have done that? Would it have helped? Your thoughts on that? I know it's a loaded question.
And another very large question that I'm going to try to answer by giving you a very long response. I'm hoping you're going to just edit out the bits that you want. That's the trick in radio, right? Or in all media. We're going to be selective. I have looked at numerous examples in the past where people have been trying to use computer-based consulting for politics. Recently, a Jill Lepore study made a lot of waves and was widely reviewed, looking at elections in the United States 40, 50 years ago and how they introduced that. Predictive modeling. Now, nobody should be surprised. We have predictive modeling everywhere. Talking to KUCI listeners means talking to UC Irvine students, staff, and faculty. UC Irvine uses predictive modeling, taking you as a paper person, as data construct, right? Your high school grades, your test scores, your first year grades, to do predictive modeling for certain majors. That's not something that you're ever communicated. It doesn't show up in Canvas or Triple E, but the institution wants to know the people we have admitted, are they likely to graduate on time in the major they chose? If it looks like there's some outliers who are likely to not graduate on time, what are the factors? Is it money? Is it availability of classes? Is it that they perhaps could do very well in a different field, but they chose a field where they're going to struggle? Is the struggle good for them, or is the struggle the wrong struggle for them, etc.? Nobody's fully comfortable with institutions knowing that much about us, but we're all in that situation. Credit bureaus do it to us. Governments do it to us. Anybody that I do commercial transactions with, like Netflix and Amazon, give me recommendations. Spotify gives me recommendations. Why shouldn't UCI also, at least in the background, look at predictive modeling and say, oh, if you like this class, you're really going to like that class. In the same way that Netflix tries to steer you to, whatever they're peddling. There's also some room for pushback, of course. We want to be really ethical about this kind of predictive modeling. We want to make it so that it's not self-serving and that it's not manipulating people without their consent or their awareness. A few years ago, there was a big flap about search engines not being neutral. And you and I are not the same age. We don't come from the same part of the planet. We don't have the same story. So if you and I right now simultaneously put the same phrase into a search engine, we would not get the same result.
Right. Partly
because of what you've searched before and what I've searched before. Partly because of what the browser knows about me and about you, etc. It kind of makes sense that companies want to customize that, personalize that, but it's also kind of disturbing because we still hold on to the idea that there should be a set of good answers, and why shouldn't I get the same good answer that you get? Why should my good answer be influenced by advertising, by history, by my age? Right? So there are some disturbances in the force when we go online. And some of that is understandable and actually is in the interest of not pretending that everybody's the same, because we aren't. And some of it is actually distorted by things that we might not wish to recognize as such, by advertising interests that aren't giving me the straight answer, aren't giving me the best, first page of results, because they try to, see me as somebody who I'm not, or not see me the way that I see myself. That discrepancy in predictive modeling is still there, and that's why I said in all of these systems we want to have the human in the loop. It shouldn't be that EEE pings you and says, no, we won't let you enroll in this class with Peter Kropp because you're not going to get the grade that you want. We're going to send you into this other class. No. At the very least, it should be your counselor, it should be an advisor, it should be somebody in your major who says, okay, this class, that's going to be, outside of the predicted path that I see. Why do you think you're going to take that direction, etc. Make it a decision that the person makes rather than that the black box algorithm makes for us. Right? And we can extrapolate that and see the same kinds of conversations happening, for instance, in automatic driving, self-driving cars. How do we teach them the trade-off between, avoiding certain obstacles and not avoiding others? Is the car obliged to protect its inhabitants, occupants, more than protect a dog on the street or a stroller on the street or whatever? What are the trade-offs? What are the ethical decisions that people make much better still than machines do it? People are slower, but they arrive at a decision that they find more satisfying. Computers are much faster, but they arrive at decisions that are not always convincing to humans.
Right. And, there's so many things I wanted to ask you, because this is, at this point, simulations and predictive modeling is basically kind of a discussion of the world we live in at this point. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the predictive policing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but there was a sheriff in a Florida county who installed predictive policing, and it ran it did simulations. It ran models, predictive models. And the outcome was that he ended up his deputies ended up harassing, people who would have otherwise, the algorithm said they were going to commit a crime, but they did not. And so, what are your feelings about, because no matter what we do, these models are going to have real world consequences. And so what are your feelings about using these models for things like policing, and how do we avoid these pitfalls? Because, an arrest can ruin someone's life. So how do we avoid doing that?
I'm not an expert in predictive policing, but I think it's a side effect of what I was urging just a moment ago, namely to keep humans in the loop, is that humans are basically the ones who are training these systems.
Right.
And unfortunately, if the humans involved in training a particular system for marketing, for policing, for search, for advertising, if they are biased, and they are, then that bias can be exacerbated in the automatic system. Right? So we've seen chatbots that within a few days become offensively racist cussing machines. And we've seen predictive policing that very clearly has incorporated a racial bias that may or may not be based on some good intention somewhere, saying, we're seeing more crime in a certain part of the population or a certain part of town, and they just bake that into the set of assumptions instead of saying that means we need to react differently, we need to act differently. They say, that's just what that's going to be. If you look this way, if you're in that age group, if you're in that socioeconomic background, if you drive that kind of car, if you drive at that kind of speed, then you're much more likely to be a problem. That may or may not be something that is just anecdotal. We're finding a lot of examples of where you can see racial bias. There's been some gender bias that's been detected at the same time or separately, and it's partly something that can be fixed. These are still young, new technologies. And it's partly something that maybe we can't overcome because we want them to be based on human input, right? We do respect some level of experience and expertise to say that, if this is the chief of police or the mayor or the governor or, the epidemiologist or, the nuclear scientist, then we're going to respect what they want the system to do because they're the ones it works for, right? But at the same time, eventually, when it's fully engaged, when it's released, it needs to work for everybody, not just for the greater glory of epidemiology or governors or whatever, but it needs to, especially in policing, there's some big differences in opinion, what policing can do, what policing should do, what policing must not do. And there's just inherent bias. So I think that's going to be teething problems for much more time to come than we're comfortable with, right? Which is also one of the reasons why predictive analytics in education are kept under the hat, are sort of they're just a check for the institution, saying do we know how to track this so that increasingly we can trust this, right? We're not going to make any decisions on it now, but we're observing ourselves because we trust data, we're scientifically minded, we're academically minded, we want to have a record that outlasts the term of an administrator or the institutional experience of staff or the different generations of students. It's complicated because things change all the time. When I started in 2004 at UC Irvine, the student body looked completely different than it does now. We're so much more Asian, so much more international, so much more diverse now than in 2004. And you see that every corner of campus, not just among the students, but also among the employees. It's great, right? It's also the change in the city of Irvine. It's great. But it means that you have an entirely different set of assumptions, right?
Right.
So if we were still living with, let's say, a predictive analytics from 2004, it would be completely wrong for the institution we are now. And the same thing is true for predictive policing in cities that are, or in states even, that are trying to phase those in as something that could be helpful. Ideally, it's going to eventually, like 10 years from now or whatever, replace our own anecdotal, inherently biased reactions to say, oh, you know what? You're 19, so you're going to be more likely to be this way. You're 50, so you're more likely to be that way. Maybe that's true. We all make those snap judgments, but you shouldn't make any policing decisions based on that kind of attitude. It's just attitude, right?
Right.
Yes, it's based on my personal experience, but my personal experience is not good enough to carry a weapon, right? My personal experience should be as well informed and well intentioned in that situation as can be. So eventually, I believe that there's possibly one tool, but right now it's very clearly immature. Eventually, I think some very, very ambitious social scientists who are building very, very complicated simulations are going to get much better results than currently. But this year in particular, 2020 has shown that political, economic, stock market, election, etc., things are so wildly unpredictable right now that everybody's models are failing. Everybody's models are failing. Even the models that have been built with dozens of experts over dozens of years, they're off now because we're unpredictable. As individually, we're already unpredictable, and collectively, much more so. But I do know one sociology professor in Switzerland who wants to build a universal simulator, and he actually asked the European community for 1 billion euros in funding. For a simulator that would take basically all kinds of real-time data about countries and their economic and cultural and social makeup, and come up with real-time advice about what's going on. I think that's still a science fiction pipe dream. But people are working on those things. We are very ambitious for scaling up the techniques that we have, so that it's not just a tool for political consulting or military planning or video game developers, but it can become something that's applicable in multiple walks of life. And I think it does have the potential, as long as we steer away from things that are obviously racist or detrimental in other ways. And keep in mind, video games get away with a lot of stuff because, they're still a realm of fantasy and of acting out, and whereas things are okay. That's partly, I think, the appeal of games and television shows and films, that, things are imaginable, are possible, that aren't in our life, right? So it's a little bit of, it's a dose of escapism, it's a dose of what if, what if I could act out on my worst impulses? What would the consequences be? And I don't think we should take the naive view that this is going to lead us down some dark path if everybody is seduced by TikTok to report back to China. That's not the case. I think people are becoming, I always go back to, learning to swim or learning to read and write. If you learn how to swim, and there's some universities that require every student to be able to swim. Stanford famously, the people who endowed Stanford had a kid drown, so they needed a condition that all Stanford students must be able to swim. Learning to swim doesn't make you somebody who just follows orders. Right? Learning to write doesn't make you somebody who just takes dictation. These things are not something that our body is naturally good at. As fat as I am, I don't float, right? So if I'm going to swim, I need to move in ways that my body isn't naturally doing. So I learn how to learn things. Right? If I learn to write, if I learn to read, I learn to not just take in inputs and produce outputs, but I actually now have information available to me that can not just be dictation, not just be orders, in a sense that a machine takes input and then executes the order. But we have critical capacity, we can think about it, we can feel about it, we can take our time, etc. We learn how to learn, right? So somebody who's learned to swim or learned to read or learned to write can now communicate, can now disagree, can now express themselves poetically or not, politically or not, and learn other things. Once you've learned to learn, then you can learn all kinds of things, up to very, very complicated things like flying a helicopter. It doesn't mean that you have to fly the helicopter exactly the way that it was done in the simulator or your instructor did. But once you're trusted with a very valuable machine, and you trust your own life and the life of your passengers to that machine, you've learned to do things with it, right? So your technology has become something that you can do something with. And that's where it becomes interesting. And that's always going to be unpredictable. People do things with computer games that the computer game designers don't foresee. People do things with computers and mobile phones that the designers of those devices do not foresee. And that's where it stays interesting. Humans are always going to do new stuff. Right. They're always going to seek out other people who are like them or completely unlike them. They're always going to have human frailties, but that's why we like humans, because they're like us. We're not perfect. We're not machine programmed. We're not totally predictable. No predictive policing or predictive educational analytics is ever going to tell you what your GPA will be when you graduate or what your salary will be 10 years after. As much as we collectively want to model that, because it's something important to the institution, it does not put the individual on some kind of strict rails. Right? That would be very boring, very disappointing, very inhuman, but I don't think that can happen either. So predictive policing is a difficult topic because of the bias that we see in the country and in other countries, but it has the potential of making us think collectively about what policing is, what the stakes of policing are, what computing is, what the stakes of computing are, what kind of data do we always trail behind us as we use credit cards, as we move our phones around, etc. Be more aware of that and be aware that other people are doing it too, and that collectively adds up to a picture of what people are doing at a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular situation. And that's valuable to companies, to advertisers, to institutions. So it should be valuable to us individually as well.
Mm-hmm. And then also, I kind of wanted to touch on this also. You mentioned, there was the researcher, the social scientist who wanted to build a model of the world. But prior to that, you mentioned that the computing, there's just not a lot of computing power, right, behind, in order to create the model of the world. And there's it's relatively new technology, the quantum computing, right, where instead of being binary, there's the particle or the wave, and so the uncertainty allows for us to encode more data into that bit. Would quantum computing revolutionize simulation, or do the computers we have, are they sufficient to create a model of the world, or would we need to develop that quantum computing more so to the point where it could effectively run a simulation of the world? What are your thoughts on that?
From what I understand about quantum computing right now, it's exponentially faster, but for very selective tasks. Right? So it's not as if you can say, quantum computers will do everything faster than computers currently do. They are currently already doing certain things way better than any other computers currently do. Right. We've run in the history of computing into some material limitations and some electrical engineering limitations that quantum computers can blow past. But they currently, where they're doing very well, is in a very, very limited, specialized field, right? So sort of special situation computers. And it's particularly interesting to me in my research when we think about the flip side of what I was just talking about, all the sharing and maybe oversharing and advertising and data hoovering. One reaction to that, one important aspect here that we haven't talked about yet, is the need for some privacy. Not secrecy necessarily, but privacy. Right? If I talk to my doctor, I don't necessarily want to broadcast all the anxieties I have. If I talk to my bank, I don't necessarily want to share with all my neighbors the money that I have or don't have. That might be the topic of that conversation. If I talk to Amazon, I have to give them a way of charging me for what I buy, or whichever other. I don't mean to single out one retailer, but it's a big one. Right? If I talk to any business, or if I'm doing business, if I have a business, I'm doing business with somebody else, I don't want my competitors necessarily to know what our agreement is, what the length of the agreement is, what price, what other conditions. Right? There's a need for restricting channels to a communication that is trusted, verifiable, and in some senses exclusive. Right? If somebody is religious, they may have a model for that where they can confess in somebody and have that be held in confidence, right? In the same way in which we think attorneys or doctors should hold certain information in confidence. So what we use for that is encryption, right? So you go to your browser window and you see that there's a lock symbol up there, and you don't think about it much, but very complicated things are going on in the background on both ends that say, okay, I don't need to know all your secrets, but I know that you give me temporary access to your PayPal account or your credit card or your medical record or your legal file, or in the university setting, we have to consider FERPA, protection of the student against privacy violations, but also HIPAA, protection of the patients in the medical environment that the University of California also is engaged in. So we have a lot of information about you, about me, that isn't public. We are a public university, but not everything we do is going to be automatically accessible to everybody publicly. Computers have become very good at making that happen in the background, so you don't have to worry too much about it. As long as you have some hygiene in your password use and so you remind yourself that certain things are done in an encrypted channel rather than an open channel, and you're going to be okay. I've taught classes about the media history of encryption, one of my favorite topics, because it's a great way to teach the history of media, the history of communication. You can find passages in the Bhagavad Gita and the Bible and ancient Greek literature about how to communicate something confidentially or secretly. It's not just about, everybody has secrets, right? There's a reason you close the door when you go to the bathroom. There's a reason you close the door when people go into the bedroom, etc. They're not necessarily shameful or bad things. They're just very human things, but we don't feel like sharing them with everybody.
Right.
We don't broadcast them. But there's also the need for business confidence, or a military or diplomatic correspondence that's protected. Quantum computers are much faster at breaking encryption than conventional computing. So what to me currently looks like a safe level of encryption can be broken by a quantum computer in a much faster time. Right? So currently, if I have an interaction with the university that happens in the virtual private network, the VPN, right? Let's say I access my library record, or I access my employee, human benefits page. It's not perfectly secure forever, but a highly dedicated, let's say, supercomputer that the NSA operates can get to that eventually. But it's reasonably secure if it takes them longer than that information is valuable, right? Yesterday's news today, not so interesting. Last year's news today, that's almost history already, right? But a quantum computer can slice through encryption in a different way. So we're currently facing the need for a quantum computing secure level of encryption. So think about it in terms of your dorm room or your apartment. It has windows with handles on it, doors with locks. It's not secure against every kind of intruder, but it's secure against a reasonable level of, anticipating intrusion, possible intrusion, right? No rats or dingbats are going to wander into, no dogs or birds are going to accidentally enter if you don't want them to.
Right.
Because you know how to close the windows, you know how to lock the doors, you know how to secure your browser window or your apps on your phone to the appropriate level of paranoia. Like, you don't want to be up here all the time and making yourself crazy.
Right.
You don't want to have 10 locks on your room unless it's Fort Knox. But now it turns out there's some level that can approach that problem from a completely different angle. Right? Quantum computing approaches these kinds of number crunching problems very differently and much more effectively, which has made some things that we've relied on for a long time. Since the 70s, we've been basically relying on a certain type of handshake between computers to make things safe. That's no longer safe. But as far as I'm not an expert in quantum computing, by the way, I don't want any listeners to believe that I'm pretending to be one. But I'm very fascinated with the long history of secure and secret communications. And that used to be a domain for humanities types like me, people who are good with different languages, people who are good with close readings, with puzzles, etc., all the way into the 1930s, when we started using mechanical devices that were a little more easy to operate, but they were not completely computerized yet. With the introduction of the computer, the electromechanical and then digital calculation became much more complicated. It became a domain of higher math. It became a domain of number theory, of trying to find very, very large prime numbers that you can factor. So you multiply two primes, it becomes a very, very long number. I can give you that number, and you don't know what the two numbers were that I used to derive that number. Right? It's easy for me, or relatively easy for me, to multiply two large numbers with one another. It's very hard for you to get the results, the product, and come up and derive the two numbers that I must have used.
Right.
So it's an asymmetrical problem. Right? Relatively technically easy for you, very technically difficult. Easy for me, technically difficult for you.
Right.
That asymmetry is basically what we rely on in computer-based communication. Right? Anybody who intercepts something that's been encrypted or receives something that's encrypted, it is not meant for them. If I have not allowed them to open it in the proper way, they're faced with a number crunching problem that is very time consuming. And that time consuming thing is what makes it secure. It's not impossible, but it takes a long time. For quantum computers, it doesn't take as long time, so that makes what we think of as secure computing a lot less secure. It begins to look a little insecure. So currently there's a very lively debate among computer scientists, among people in informatics, among people in politics, to come up with a way of saying, where do we distinguish the level of exposure? What's our risk level here? What's our threat model? Okay, so student information at UC Irvine is probably not something that a Chinese hacker is interested in. What's their motivation?
I don't even think the UCI students are interested.
Not that particularly juicy a target. But research data in an engineering lab on campus or in an institution that is seeded by talent from the university, that could be a target, right? Information about a large number of people. We've seen intrusions into databases of government employees.
Yep.
Individually they might be boring, right? Collectively, that's information that you can make use of. When were they where? Now I can extrapolate which one of them might be working for three-letter agencies under a different identity, etc. So you can, if you know how to parse, how to slice and dice large data sets, and you know how to access them, that can be valuable. So that valuable little information now needs to be shielded differently.
Right.
And it's probably not as general a problem as disinformation or other kinds of computer to computer operations are that we've talked about before, but it is a coming problem for any institution, large or small, state or private, educational institution as well. So, if alumni of UC Irvine want their information about their educational experience to be not exploited in various ways, we need to make sure as an institution to keep it in a proper way.
Right.
And the other day, I saw that the university is at least putting together some heads to figure out, what is the proper data governance. We know where the biggest risk fields are. We have some people working on actinide science, that's related to nuclear chain reactions. Of course, they know that that's sensitive. But there's many areas where individually maybe we think what we do isn't that particularly interesting, but collectively could be a valuable target. So the more we trust all our interactions to computers and to network computers, the more they can possibly add up to something that somebody else is going to try to change, manipulate, or just look at and exploit in various ways. So that's the level of where I understand quantum computers to make a big difference. I do not yet see a universal simulator using quantum computing because it's very onerous, it's very difficult right now to build these systems. Right now, most of the stuff that we hear about anyway is used to show a proof of concept. Look, we can communicate from here to here. From the ground to the moon or to a satellite. We can now do certain mathematical routines that were very expensive and slow. We can do them more quickly, more cheaply in terms of electricity and mathematical resources and engineering resources that go into it. But it's a field where multiple outfits around the globe are investing a huge amount of effort. So we could be surprised very quickly by a more general application of quantum computing that is able to do more general computing tasks. But right now, I believe we're not there yet. Right now, I don't think that somebody could build like an Earth 2.0. We get some very detailed maps. Google Earth, and now Microsoft has rolled out in their latest version of the plane simulator game, very, very detailed maps. That used to be information that was either impossible to get or very, very difficult to get. I remember that. I remember when there was no GPS in your phone and in your car. I remember when maps were things on paper that would deteriorate, and you'd only get a certain kind of small subset of the information that you can get now at the tip of the finger for free, mostly for free, in a resolution that was unthinkable only years ago. So it's been an exponential improvement in the level of information we get, the detail of information we get about our lives and about our physical situation and about our virtual, digital relations. And if that continues in this exponential way, maybe I'll still live to see a grand simulation that is running on a quantum computing. I may not be able to understand it because it becomes very, very complex. And that's what I was calling black boxing before. And in the 60s and 70s, people realized, yes, we can put a lot of stuff inside a computer and make it intuitive and easy for control interfaces, mouse, pointers, keyboards, displays to handle information But that doesn't mean that we really understand what it is exactly that we're doing. And that's partly also the problem we talked about when we're talking about predictive analytics or predictive policing. Not everybody understands what has gone into the box. Right? So in the old days, when your game was on the floor or on the table, you could see everything that goes into the situation. The moment you stuff some of the accounting, some of the what if, into a box that does the accounting for you, it's very convenient, but if you don't understand how it works, maybe it's not the way that you would want to do it. So that's the trade-off. We need some systems to be automated. Hey, I'm not telling my body, breathe in, breathe out. I'm not telling my body, dilute your pupils, make your pupils smaller in response to light or whatever. Certain things are automated for a reason, right? They're relegated to a lower level of control in the very complicated thing that I am. And maybe we'll get to a point where we can trust our computers in the way that we trust our bodies, but only if we train them in the way that we train our bodies. Remember my analogy of learning to swim or learning to write, learning to read, learning new skills in social media. You were suggesting that children not grow up with that. Hopefully, that doesn't mean that it becomes something that is just unconscious. Hopefully, it still keeps somebody in the loop, a critical capacity, and a facility to use that not just for fun or stimulation, but for learning, for communication, for disagreement, for the purposes of finding people who are like me or unlike me, so that we can do certain things that are playful or sport or serious intellectual endeavors or political endeavors or economic exchange, etc.
Okay, and there were so many things I wanted to ask, but I don't want to take up all of your time. So I'm just going to ask the last two questions that I always ask. If students are interested in learning more about your research, where can they go to learn more about you and your research? And also, if students are interested in getting involved, is that possible? I mean, I know COVID's changed things, so is that still possible? And if that's possible, how can they do that?
Great question. So currently, unfortunately, it's not that easy. We don't have, I used to say, office hours. Like no employee of the university is ever going to be anything other than flattered if you come and ask them a question, right? People who, especially faculty, people who work at the university are there to have that kind of conversation. If somebody is curious about what you do, you just go ask them, And I know students are shy sometimes, or they're busy, or they're away from campus, but I always, when I was department chair especially, I would always urge the students to say, don't be a stranger, just go to office hours. Even if it's just a few minutes with that person, you might get some interesting ideas, you can get your question in, you can get your complaint in. Don't just do it by email, go and see the person. That's become a little harder right now, but my office hours are on Zoom. We're doing this on Zoom. I've been relatively responsive to your emails as well.
Yes.
I'm happy to follow up on email. I should have told you right at the beginning that when I knew that we were going to talk today, I had a big coffee. Normally I don't drink coffee in the morning. So the reason I talk so much and the reason I asked you to edit this down is because I'm over-caffeinated. That's a professional hazard as well, right? So faculty will be liable to talk a lot. Students know that too. Students know exactly how to press that button in class and say, let me see how long I can make the faculty go off on this in this direction. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. It's a game that students play, right? And faculty hopefully know how to get back to what they wanted to do in that class and not just indulge the person who raises a question. So in class, in office hours, if you're interested in something that isn't necessarily part of the current conversation, feel free to ask. If you feel like, oh, that person knows something I want to bring up, have that discussion with them, have that debate with them, have that fight with them, and say, I disagree. You said something you should not have said. I see it differently. Believe me, people value that kind of interaction. That's why faculty are faculty members. So that's my number one thing to your question. Getting involved, it's the same thing. Right now, it's not that easy to get together and to say, look, this is what I'm working on. Here's what you could look at, etc. But speaking of the things that you brought up, simulation, the talk that you saw was part of a summer program at Cal IT2, so a program for Europe, the Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program at Cal IT2. They ran that together, summer program. There are always a number of students who are doing summer research in that scope. Of course, Europe also can be in fall, winter, spring. So if anybody on campus is interested in doing something that isn't covered by current classes or extends from what they really enjoyed in the current class, they can go to that faculty member and say, hey, I'd like to do more on that. I'd like to read more, write more, think more, talk more, model more, play more in that direction. Can we set that up as a research project? That's how these things are set up.
Okay.
And even though now we have to do it on Zoom, it's still possible.
Okay. All right. So thank you for doing. Thank you for doing this. This was awesome. I actually do want to, if it's possible, maybe in 10, 12 weeks, could I do another interview with you? Because I have so many questions. Because your field is so fascinating, and I'm sure I'm going to get a ton of emails asking more questions from other people. Because this will go up on Spotify and Apple iTunes for iPod download, and usually I get emails, people asking follow-up questions. So
classes are not in session yet, so I'm not totally swamped yet. So if we can do that before classes start, my head will still be available. After that, maybe email is better, but I know email is not the greatest thing for KUCI.
But thank you for doing this. This was so amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate this. Once again, this was Peter Kropp, and this was on KUCI 88.9 FM.